She chose 70 cattle over a new combine. Every man in Harlan County, Iowa, thought she had lost her mind. They said it at the feed store. They said it at the grain elevator. They said it at the First Lutheran Church on Sunday mornings when Agnes Holt had already driven home and could not hear them. They said, "That woman is going to lose everything." They said, "You cannot run a modern farm operation on beef cattle and stubbornness." They said, "Wait until the first clearing comes and see where Agnes Holt is standing." They meant that as a threat. It turned out to be a prophecy. Because when the first clearing came, when the 1980s farm crisis finally arrived in Harlan County with its collapsed commodity prices and its doubled interest rates and its bank letters that landed on kitchen tables like verdicts, Agnes Holt was the only farmer in the county still standing exactly where she had always stood, on her own land, with her own cattle, with no debt that anyone could take from her. And not one person in Harlan County was laughing anymore. But before we get to the clearing, you need to understand who Agnes Holt was, and why a woman who had every reason to do what everyone else was doing chose 70 cattle instead. Because that choice did not come from ignorance. It did not come from stubbornness. It came from something nobody in Harlan County gave her credit for having. It came from a ledger, and what was written in that ledger was about to change everything. To understand Agnes Holt's decision, you have to understand what Iowa farming felt like in the late 1970s and early 1980s. It felt like winning. Land values were climbing. Commodity prices were strong. The government was encouraging expansion. Plant every acre you can, they said. The world needs American grain, and American farmers are the ones to provide it. And the equipment companies were right there beside the government, showing farmers the future. Bigger combines, wider headers, precision machinery that could do in a day what used to take a week. All you had to do was borrow. Borrow against your land, which was worth more every year. Borrow against your future yields, which the market seemed to guarantee would always be profitable. Borrow and expand and modernize and compete. Every farmer in Harlan County was doing it. Every farmer except Agnes Holt. Agnes Holt had been farming her 180 acres in Harlan County since 1971 when her husband Raymond passed and left her the operation. Raymond had been a good farmer and a good man. He had also died with more debt than Agnes had known about. She found out the week after the funeral when the bank called. She spent 3 months going through every document, every account, every loan statement Raymond had accumulated across 10 years of farming the way most men farmed in that era, borrowing when the borrowing felt justified and trusting that the yields would cover it. She cleared the debt in 1974. It took everything, every reserve, every piece of equipment that was not absolutely essential, one of the 2 trucks, the expansion Raymond had been planning. She cleared it, and she sat at the kitchen table the night the last payment went through and made herself a promise. She would never again farm in a way that required someone else's permission to keep going. If you are watching The Harvest Empire for the first time, welcome. We tell the stories history forgot. Subscribe right now and hit the bell so you never miss one. Now, back to Agnes. That promise shaped every decision Agnes Holt made for the next decade. She did not expand. When the land values were climbing and every other farmer in Harlan County was borrowing against their acreage to buy more acreage, Agnes stayed at 180 acres. She did not modernize. When the equipment companies came around with their new combines and their favorable financing terms and their impressive specifications, Agnes listened politely and did not sign anything. She maintained what she had, carefully, deliberately, the way a woman manages a farm when she understands that everything you borrow against is everything you can lose. And in 1981, when the Iowa Agricultural Extension Office published a report suggesting that commodity grain prices, which had been strong for years, were showing signs of instability that farmers carrying heavy equipment debt should consider carefully, Agnes Holt read that report 3 times. Then she made a decision that Harlan County talked about for months. She sold her grain equipment. Not all of it, not the essentials. The big combine Raymond had bought in 1969, the one she had maintained for 12 years and that still ran well enough to sell for real money. She sold it. And with the money she bought 70 head of cattle, The reaction in Harlan County was immediate. Agnes Holt had sold her combine and bought cattle. In 1981, when every serious farmer in the county was going the other direction, bigger equipment, more acreage, more yield, more market position, Agnes Holt had gone backward, or so they said. At the feed store, a man named Dale Burrows, who had just taken delivery of a new $180,000 combine on a 10-year financing plan, shook his head and said what most of them were thinking. That woman, he said, has no idea how modern farming works. Others were kinder in their language, but arrived at the same conclusion. Cattle were old-fashioned. Cattle were labor-intensive. Cattle required constant attention, constant feeding, constant management. A combine you could run yourself and cover 300 acres a day. 70 cattle needed you every single morning whether you felt like it or not. And in a county where grain farming was the identity and the combine was the symbol of a serious operation, choosing cattle over machinery was not just a financial decision. It was a statement. And the statement it made, to most of Harlan County, was that Agnes Holt did not know what she was doing. They were about to find out how wrong they were. But before we get to how wrong they were, and I need you to stay with me here, because what happens next is not what anyone expected. Drop a comment below right now. Would you have chosen the cattle or the combine? Tell us. And if Agnes's story is speaking to you, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Agnes was not unaware of what was being said. Small counties do not keep secrets well, and Harlan County was no exception. She heard it at the grain elevator. She heard it from the woman who cut her hair every 6 weeks. She heard it from her neighbor to the east, a good-natured man named Clifford Marsh, who stopped by one afternoon with what he clearly intended as friendly advice. Clifford stood on her porch and told her, gently and with genuine concern, that the cattle market was unpredictable and that her operation would be more stable if she reconsidered the combine sale and got back into grain production where the real money was. Agnes offered him coffee. She listened to everything he said. Then she said, "Clifford, I appreciate that. I really do. But I have done my calculations and I am comfortable with where I am." Clifford left, looking slightly confused. The confusion of a man who had expected either agreement or an argument and received neither. Agnes went back to her cattle. Now here is where Agnes Holt's story stops being about cattle. Wait for it. Because what Agnes did next had nothing to do with her herd or her pasture or her balance sheet. It had to do with a ledger she had been keeping since 1974, not of her own finances, but of everyone else's. Every equipment purchase she had watched her neighbors make, every loan amount she had overheard at the grain elevator, every financing term the salesman had mentioned at the county meetings she attended without buying anything. Agnes Holt had been keeping a record of exactly how much debt Harlan County had accumulated, and she knew, to within a reasonable margin, exactly what the clearing was going to cost each of them. She had known for 2 years. She had said nothing, not because she wanted them to fail, because nobody had asked. Because here is what Agnes Holt understood, that nobody in Harlan County was giving her credit for understanding. She understood debt. She understood it the way you only understand it when you have spent 3 years paying off a dead man's loans and watching everything you thought was secure become contingent on a bank's patience. And she understood, from reading the extension office report, from watching the interest rate numbers, from the particular way that equipment company salesmen were pushing financing terms a little harder than they needed to if the business was as solid as they claimed, that the decade of prosperity that every farmer in Harlan County was borrowing against was not going to last as long as they thought it would. She did not know exactly when it would end. She knew it would end. And when it did, when the combine payments came due in a market that was no longer paying combine prices, she intended to be the farmer in Harlan County with no combine payment. 70 cattle, her own pasture, her own land, no debt, no permission required from anyone. Agnes ran her cattle operation with the same precision she had applied to Raymond's debt. She managed her herd carefully, not just for beef production, but for the full range of value a cattle operation could generate. She sold beef directly to buyers she cultivated herself, cutting out the middlemen that reduced her margins. She managed her pasture rotation with the attention of someone who understood that the land feeding her cattle was as important as the cattle themselves. She kept her equipment minimal and maintained. She kept her books with absolute precision. And she kept her debt at zero. Every morning before sunrise, she was in the pasture. Every evening, she was in the barn. She did not go to the feed store conversations about commodity prices and equipment financing. She did not need to. While Harlan County's farmers were watching grain markets and making payments on machinery that cost more every year to run, Agnes Holt was watching her herd grow and her land stay healthy and her balance sheet stay clean. There were nights, Agnes would admit this to Carol years later, sitting on the same porch where Clifford had given her his advice. There were nights when she lay awake and wondered if she had read it wrong. The grain prices were still holding. The combines were still running. The men at the feed store were still making their payments and their plans and their confident predictions. And Agnes Holt had 70 cattle and a pasture and a balance sheet with no debt on it, and sometimes at 2 a.m. that felt less like wisdom and more like stubbornness wearing wisdom's clothes. She got up those mornings and went to the pasture anyway, because the cattle needed feeding regardless of whether she was right. And then, in the winter of 1982, the clearing began. The clearing came the way these things always come. Not all at once, slowly, then suddenly. Interest rates that had been climbing for 2 years doubled again in 1981 and stayed there. The Federal Reserve's decision to tighten monetary policy to fight inflation was exactly the right decision for the national economy and exactly the wrong timing for farmers who had borrowed at variable rates against land values that were now, as commodity prices began to fall, no longer rising. The combine Dale Burrows had financed at $180,000 now required monthly payments that his grain revenue at collapsed commodity prices could not cover. Dale was not alone. Every farmer in Harlan County who had borrowed to expand, borrowed to modernize, borrowed against land values that were now falling rather than rising, every single one of them was doing the same math in the winter of 1982 and arriving at the same answer. The answer did not work. Bank letters started arriving. Not the routine correspondence of an ongoing loan relationship. The other kind. The kind that used words like delinquency and restructuring, and in some cases foreclosure. The Harlan County farmers, who had been laughing at Agnes Holt's cattle 18 months earlier, were no longer laughing at anything. We are right at the turn of this story. What Agnes does during the clearing is the part that nobody in Harlan County ever forgot. Leave a like right now if this story is holding you. It costs nothing, and it tells this channel to keep building stories like this one. Stay with me. Agnes watched the clearing happen from her fence line. She did not celebrate. She was not that kind of woman. She watched her neighbors, men she had known for years, men who had been kind to her even when they were condescending, men who had built real operations and worked genuinely hard. She watched them receive the letters and make the phone calls and sit across from bank officers who were having versions of the same conversation all across the Iowa Farm Belt. Clifford Marsh, her neighbor to the east, the one who had come to her porch with friendly advice about getting back into grain production, received his restructuring notice in February of 1983. He came to Agnes's fence line one morning. He stood there for a long time without speaking. She walked over. He did not say much. He did not need to. Agnes looked at him across the fence with an expression that held no triumph and no told you so. Just the quiet acknowledgement of two people who understood that one of them had made a different choice, and the difference was now visible in every direction. I should have listened more carefully, Clifford said. You were doing what made sense to you at the time, Agnes said. So was I. She meant that. The 1980s farm crisis was not a story of foolish men and a wise woman. It was a story of a system that rewarded borrowing during good years and punished it during bad ones, and one woman who had learned, through personal grief and personal loss, to make her decisions as if the bad years were always coming. Because they were. They always were. What happened next in Harlan County is the part of Agnes Holt's story that people still talk about. Because Agnes Holt, the woman they had laughed at, the woman they had dismissed, the woman whose cattle they had called old-fashioned, did something nobody expected. She helped them. Not with money she did not have to spare. With knowledge she did have. And with the ledger. She opened it for the first time to anyone outside her kitchen. She showed her neighbors what she had been recording since 1974. The equipment costs. The loan figures. The financing terms. The debt accumulation she had been watching build across Harlan County for 8 years, while everyone was watching the grain prices and the land values, and not the number that was quietly growing underneath both of them. She showed them the number, not to shame them, to help them understand what they were actually dealing with, so they could start rebuilding from a position of honest clarity, rather than the fog of denial that makes recovery twice as hard. She spent the following 2 years, 1983 and 1984, sharing what she knew about low-debt farming with every neighbor who asked, about cattle management, about pasture rotation, about the specific ways a farm operation could be restructured to reduce dependency on commodity grain prices and equipment financing. She was not a preacher about it. She did not say, "I told you so," even once. She just answered every question anyone asked her, honestly and completely, and without making them feel worse than they already felt about the choices that had brought them to her fence line. Dale Burrows came in the spring of 1984. He had lost the new combine in the restructuring. He was starting over with much less than he had built. He sat at Agnes's kitchen table, and she made coffee, and she opened the ledger, and they talked for 3 hours about what a farm operation looks like when it is built around what cannot be taken rather than what can. When he left, he shook her hand at the door. He did not say much. Neither did she. But they both understood that something had shifted in Harlan County that would not shift back. Agnes Holt farmed her 180 acres in Harlan County, Iowa, for another 22 years after the clearing. She never bought a new combine. She never borrowed more than one season's operation required. She never stopped running cattle on land that she had decided, in 1974, when she paid off Raymond's debt, would never again depend on someone else's patience to survive. Her herd grew to 120 head by 1990. Her pasture remained some of the healthiest land in the county, managed with the same rotation discipline she had applied from the beginning, the soil improving every season rather than degrading under the pressure of monoculture grain production. When the County Agricultural Extension Office published a case study in 1989 about Iowa farms that had survived the 1980s crisis without foreclosure, Agnes Holt's operation was one of 12 featured. The extension agent who wrote the case study drove out to interview her on a Thursday morning in October. He asked her what she would say to farmers now, in 1989, with the crisis receding and land values beginning to recover, who were thinking about going back to the old model. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I would say remember what the clearing felt like. Not to scare yourself, not to avoid growing, but to remember that the size of what you build should always be smaller than the size of what you can afford to lose." She looked out the window at her pasture, at the cattle moving through the morning light the same way they had moved every morning since 1981. The combine would have been paid off by now, she said. She said it without bitterness, just as a fact. The combine would have been paid off and sitting in the field and worth a fraction of what it cost. The cattle are still producing. Agnes Holt passed in 2003. She left the farm to her daughter Carol, who had grown up walking those pastures, and understood the cattle the way Agnes had always hoped one of her children would. Carol kept the herd. She expanded it, eventually, to 150 head, carefully, without debt she could not service on a single bad year's income. She still runs the operation today. When people ask her what her mother taught her about farming, she gives the same answer every time. "She taught me that the farm has to be able to survive your worst year," Carol says, "not just your best one. Everything else follows from that." She chose 70 cattle over a new combine. They laughed. And then the clearing came. And when it was over, when the bank letters had landed, and the combines had gone quiet, and the good decade had revealed itself as just a decade, same as any other, Agnes Holt was still standing in her pasture. Same land, same cattle. Same certainty. The certainty of a woman who had made her calculation in 1974 at a kitchen table with a dead man's debt in front of her and decided, quietly, and permanently, that she would never again farm in a way that required someone else's permission to keep going. She did not need their laughter to prove she was right. The clearing proved it for her. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do in a room full of people going one direction is simply go the other way. Not loudly, not with a speech, just go the other way, and keep a ledger, and be ready for the clearing. If Agnes's story stayed with you today, share it with one person. Someone who is being laughed at right now for a decision that everyone else thinks is wrong. Someone who needs to be reminded that the clearing always comes, and the question is never whether you were popular before it. The question is where you are standing after. Like this video, subscribe if you have not, and leave a comment below. What decision have you made that people laughed at, that turned out to be exactly right? The next story on the Harvest Empire is already coming. By God's grace, we will see you there.